You catch yourself complaining about your circumstances, your workload, your boss, your colleagues, and, deep down, you know this negativity is poisoning your potential. Every complaint that leaves your lips weakens your resolve and distances you from the person you're capable of becoming. While you watch others face similar challenges with grace and determination, I am Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who transformed personal struggles into philosophical strength while bearing the weight of the most powerful empire in history. What I discovered about conquering the complaining mind will transform how you respond to life's inevitable challenges, using the same Stoic principles that sustained me through plagues, wars, and the burden of governing millions. The inner mastery I'll share will show you how to kill that weak, complaining version of yourself and forge an unshakable character that turns obstacles into opportunities. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for inner transformation has spread. I never asked to be emperor. When Antoninus Pius adopted me as his successor, I was a young man more interested in philosophy than politics, more drawn to contemplation than conquest. I had imagined a life of quiet study, perhaps teaching rhetoric or diving deeper into the works of Epictetus. But destiny had other plans, and when I ascended to the throne in 161 AD, I discovered that the universe had been preparing me for something far greater than my own comfort. The moment I took power, Rome was already burning not from fire, but from a plague that would eventually claim the lives of 5 million people across the empire. The Antonine Plague, as historians would later call it, swept through our territories like an invisible army, leaving death and despair in its wake. Streets that once bustled with merchants and citizens fell silent except for the cries of the dying and the rumble of carts carrying bodies to mass graves. But the plague was only one of my challenges. Germanic tribes pressed against our northern borders, sensing weakness in our distracted state. The Parthian Empire threatened our eastern provinces. Within Rome itself, senators complained endlessly about declining revenues, food shortages, and the impossibility of governing effectively under such circumstances. Every day brought new reports of disaster, new demands for impossible solutions, new voices telling me why success was beyond reach. In those early months, I felt the weight of the world crushing down upon my shoulders. I found myself falling into the same trap that destroys so many leaders. I began to complain. Why had fate given me this burden? Why couldn't I have lived in peaceful times like my predecessors? Why were the gods testing me with such insurmountable challenges? I remember one particular evening, standing on the palace balcony overlooking the city, watching smoke rise from the funeral pyres. The stench of death filled the air, and I could hear the distant wailing of families who had lost everything. In that moment, I felt utterly overwhelmed and spoke aloud to the empty night. This is impossible. No man should bear such responsibility. But then something shifted within me. Perhaps it was the philosophical training of my youth, or perhaps it was simple necessity. But I realized that my complaints were not just useless, they were actively harmful. Every moment I spent lamenting my circumstances was a moment stolen from finding solutions. Every breath wasted on why me was a breath that could have been used to serve my people. That night marked the beginning of my transformation from a complaining victim of circumstance into a philosopher emperor who would find strength in adversity. The plague-stricken streets of Rome had become my greatest teacher, showing me that external chaos could only be met with internal mastery. In my darkest moments as emperor, when the weight of an empire's suffering threatened to crush my spirit, I turned to the philosophy that had quietly shaped my youth: Stoicism. This wasn't merely an academic exercise or intellectual curiosity. It became the anchor that kept me from drowning in despair and complaint. My introduction to Stoic philosophy began years before I wore the purple robes of emperorship. As a young man, I had been drawn to the teachings of Epictetus, a former slave who had discovered profound freedom through mastering his own mind. His words resonated with something deep within me. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. But it wasn't until I faced the impossible demands of ruling during crisis that these philosophical concepts transformed from interesting ideas into vital survival tools. I remember the exact moment when philosophy saved my sanity. It was during the third week of particularly devastating plague reports, when I had barely slept for days, trying to coordinate relief efforts while managing military threats on multiple fronts. I found myself alone in my study, surrounded by scrolls detailing catastrophes I felt powerless to prevent. The complaints were pouring from my mouth like water from a broken vessel. This suffering is unbearable. The burden is too great. Why must everything fall apart under my rule? My mind was spinning in circles of frustration and self-pity. Then I remembered something Epictetus had written. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. In that moment of crisis, I made a decision that would define the rest of my reign. I would stop complaining about my circumstances and start examining my responses to them. I began what would become my daily practice of philosophical reflection. Each morning, before attending to imperial duties, I would spend time writing down my thoughts, examining my reactions to events, and reminding myself of fundamental Stoic principles. These private writings, which I never intended for public consumption, became my laboratory for developing mental resilience. In the evening, I would review the day's challenges and my responses to them. Had I complained when I could have acted? Had I wasted energy lamenting what was beyond my control? Had I maintained my virtue when faced with difficult decisions? This practice of honest self-examination became the foundation of my strength. The more I wrote, the more I realized that my complaints were not just ineffective, they were actively sabotaging my ability to serve effectively. When I complained about the plague, I wasn't helping plague victims. When I lamented barbarian invasions, I wasn't strengthening our defenses. When I bemoaned senatorial opposition, I wasn't building the coalitions necessary for effective governance. Philosophy taught me that my mind was the one domain where I held absolute sovereignty. External events, plagues, wars, political opposition, these were beyond my direct control. But my responses, my thoughts, my character, my decisions in the face of adversity, these belonged entirely to me. This realization didn't eliminate the challenges I faced as emperor, but it fundamentally changed how I approached them. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? I began asking, how can I respond to this with virtue and wisdom? The most dangerous enemy I ever faced wasn't the Germanic tribes at our borders or the Parthian armies in the east. It wasn't the plague that ravaged our cities or the senators who opposed my policies. The most dangerous enemy lived within. My own mind, disguised as justified concern, reasonable frustration, and legitimate grievance. That enemy was the voice of complaint. For years, I didn't recognize this internal adversary for what it truly was. I thought my complaints were simply honest assessments of difficult situations. When I said, "These senators are impossible to work with," I believed I was stating a fact. When I muttered, "This plague is destroying everything I've worked to build," I thought I was showing appropriate concern for my people. When I lamented, "Why do I have to deal with all these crises at once?" I convinced myself I was simply acknowledging the magnitude of my challenges. It took me months of philosophical practice and honest self-reflection to understand that complaint is actually a subtle form of mental poison. Each time I voiced frustration about my circumstances, I was reinforcing a victim mindset that undermined my effectiveness as a leader. Every moment spent lamenting what was wrong with my situation was a moment stolen from discovering what could be done to improve it. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging period. when multiple crises demanded my attention simultaneously. Reports arrived of Germanic tribes crossing our northern border, while plague continued its relentless spread through our eastern provinces. The treasury was strained, the army was stretched thin, and senators were demanding answers I didn't have. I caught myself in the middle of a familiar internal monologue. This is impossible. No emperor has ever faced so many challenges at once. How can anyone expect me to solve all these problems simultaneously? It's not fair that my reign is defined by one crisis after another. But this time, instead of accepting these thoughts as reasonable responses to stress, I examined them with the analytical precision I had learned from my philosophical studies. What exactly was I accomplishing with this internal dialogue? Was it helping me develop better strategies for defending our borders? Was it inspiring creative solutions to our resource shortages? Was it strengthening my resolve to serve my people? Effectively, the answer was devastating in its clarity. My complaints were accomplishing nothing positive while actively weakening my mental state. Every time I told myself that my situation was impossible or unfair, I was programming my mind to look for evidence to support those beliefs rather than searching for practical solutions. I realized the complaint operates like a disease of the mind, spreading from thought to thought, weakening our capacity for clear thinking and decisive action. When we complain about our circumstances, we're essentially training ourselves to be victims rather than agents of change. That day, I made a commitment that would transform my entire approach to leadership and life. I would eliminate complaint from my internal dialogue as ruthlessly as I would eliminate any enemy threatening Rome. Asterisk, the foundation of all Stoic wisdom, and the principle that completely eliminated complaint from my life is what I came to understand as the dichotomy of control. This simple yet profound concept divides all of existence into two categories: what is within our control and what lies beyond it. Once I truly grasped this distinction, complaints became not just unnecessary, but logically impossible. I first encountered this principle in the writings of Epictetus, but it wasn't until I applied it to the practical challenges of governing an empire that I understood its revolutionary power. Epictetus taught that we control our judgments, our decisions, our actions, and our responses, and absolutely nothing else. Everything external to these mental processes lies outside our domain of influence. The revelation came during my campaigns along the Danube frontier, where I spent years defending Rome against Germanic tribal invasions. I was dealing with supply shortages, harsh winter conditions, and an enemy that refused to engage in conventional warfare. My generals constantly complained about the terrain, the weather, the unpredictability of our opponents, and the inadequacy of our resources. One evening, as I listened to yet another catalogue of grievances from my commanders, I posed a simple question: of all the things you've just complained about, which ones can we actually change? The silence that followed was illuminating. The weather would remain harsh regardless of our opinions about it. The terrain would stay difficult whether we liked it or not. Our enemies would continue their guerrilla tactics irrespective of our preference for open battle. But there were elements within our control: how we prepared for harsh weather, how we adapted our tactics to difficult terrain, how we trained our soldiers to respond to unconventional warfare, how we managed our resources, and most importantly, how we maintained our morale and focus despite challenging conditions. I began applying this principle systematically to every aspect of my rule. When senators opposed my policies, instead of complaining about their stubbornness, I focused on what I could control: how clearly I communicated my vision, how persuasively I presented my arguments, how well I understood their concerns, and how effectively I built coalitions of support when the plague devastated our cities. Rather than lamenting the cruelty of fate, I concentrated on what lay within my power: organizing relief efforts, allocating medical resources, maintaining public order, and ensuring that government functions continued despite the crisis. When barbarian invasions threatened our borders, instead of cursing our enemies' persistence, I directed my energy toward what I could influence: military strategy, troop deployment, diplomatic negotiations, and the strengthening of our defenses. This practice transformed not only my effectiveness as an emperor, but my entire relationship with adversity. I discovered that most of what we call problems are actually just external circumstances that become problematic only when we waste energy trying to control what lies beyond our influence. The dichotomy of control revealed complaint for what it truly is: a futile attempt to change the unchangeable through the power of dissatisfaction. Once I accepted that external events would unfold according to their own nature rather than my preferences, I could direct all my mental energy toward the one domain where I held absolute authority: my own thoughts, decisions, and actions. The most radical shift in my thinking came when I stopped seeing obstacles as things that blocked my path and started recognizing them as the path itself. This wasn't mere philosophical wordplay, it was a complete reimagining of what constitutes progress and success. What most people call setbacks, I learned to see as setups for growth, strength, and wisdom. This transformation began during one of my most challenging military campaigns against the Marcomanni tribes. We had suffered a significant defeat in what should have been a straightforward engagement. My generals were demoralized, my soldiers were questioning our strategy, and reports back to Rome painted a picture of imperial incompetence. The easy response would have been to complain about poor intelligence, inadequate supplies, or the unexpected tactics of our enemies. Instead, I asked myself a different question: how is this defeat exactly what I need to become a better commander? The answer revealed itself gradually as I examined every aspect of our failure. The defeat exposed weaknesses in our communication systems that we could strengthen. It revealed gaps in our tactical training that we could address. It showed us the importance of adapting to unconventional warfare, forcing us to develop new strategies that would serve us well in future campaigns. Most importantly, this setback taught me something invaluable about leadership under pressure. I discovered that my response to adversity would either inspire my troops or demoralize them further. When I stopped complaining about our situation and started focusing on what we could learn from it, something remarkable happened. My commanders began approaching problems as puzzles to solve rather than burdens to bear. I began to understand what I would later write in my private meditations: the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. This wasn't abstract philosophy, it was practical wisdom born from real experience with real consequences. Every plague outbreak forced us to develop better medical protocols and more efficient distribution systems for aid. Every barbarian invasion taught us new defensive strategies and revealed opportunities to strengthen our borders. Every political opposition forced me to become more persuasive, more diplomatic, and more strategic in building consensus. The shift from complaint to curiosity became my secret weapon. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" I trained myself to ask, "What is this teaching me?" Instead of "How can I get rid of this problem?" I asked, "How can I use this problem to become stronger?" This approach required constant vigilance, because the complaining mind is persistent and clever. It disguises itself as practical concern, reasonable frustration, and justified anger. But I learned to recognize its voice and immediately redirect my attention to opportunity rather than obstacle. One of my most profound realizations was that the universe seemed to provide exactly the challenges I needed for my development as a leader and as a human being. The difficulties weren't random punishments, they were precisely calibrated training, exercises designed to build the specific strengths I lacked. When I stopped fighting against obstacles and started learning from them, I discovered that adversity was actually my most reliable teacher and my most valuable ally in the pursuit of wisdom and character, the root of all complaint. I discovered lies in the gap between what we desire and what we actually receive from life. The wider this gap, the more we suffer. The more we suffer, the more we complain. The more we complain, the less capable we become of creating the very changes we claim to want. This vicious cycle only breaks when we master what I call the discipline of desire. As emperor, I was surrounded by every luxury the ancient world could provide. My palace contained treasures from across the empire. My table was laden with delicacies from distant provinces, and my word could command virtually anything I wanted. Yet I noticed that the senators and courtiers who had the most were often the ones who complained the most. They wanted better wine, finer clothing, more elaborate entertainment, greater recognition, or increased political influence. I realized that desire, left unchecked, is an engine of perpetual dissatisfaction. No matter how much we acquire or achieve, desire simply adjusts upward, demanding more. The person who complains about their modest home will find new things to complain about when they move to a mansion. The official who grumbles about their current position will discover fresh grievances when they receive their promotion. This insight led me to experiment with voluntary limitation. I began deliberately choosing simpler food when elaborate meals were available. I wore plain clothing when ceremony didn't require imperial regalia. I slept on a hard surface rather than the luxurious imperial bed. I walked when I could have ridden in a litter. These weren't acts of self-punishment, but training exercises for my mind. I was teaching myself that happiness came not from getting what I wanted, but from wanting what I already had. I was building immunity to the complaint-inducing gap between desire and reality. By closing that gap through disciplined contentment rather than endless acquisition, the most powerful application of this principle came during times of genuine hardship, when military campaigns required me to live in basic field conditions, eating simple rations and sleeping in a tent. I discovered that my voluntary practice of limitation had prepared me well. While other commanders complained about the lack of comfort, I was perfectly content because I had trained myself to find satisfaction in necessity rather than luxury. I learned to distinguish between natural needs and manufactured wants. I needed food, but I didn't need exotic delicacies. I needed shelter, but I didn't need palatial surroundings. I needed clothing, but I didn't need the finest fabrics. By focusing on meeting my genuine needs while questioning my wants, I eliminated most opportunities for complaint. The discipline of desire also taught me something crucial about leadership. When I stopped wanting situations to be different than they were, I could see them more clearly and respond more effectively. My desire for easy victories had been blinding me to the tactical advantages available in difficult battles. My wish for compliant senators had prevented me from understanding their legitimate concerns. When I released my attachment to having things go according to my preferences, I became far more adaptable and creative in working with reality as it actually existed, rather than as I wished it would be. I made a startling discovery during my philosophical practice. Complaint cannot exist in the present moment. It lives only in the shadows of past regrets and the anxieties of future fears. When I learned to anchor my attention fully in the now, complaint simply had nowhere to take root. This realization came to me during a particularly stressful period, when I was simultaneously managing a military campaign, dealing with a treasury crisis, and responding to a new outbreak of plague in the eastern provinces. My mind was constantly jumping between reviewing past mistakes, worrying about future consequences, and analyzing all the ways current situations could deteriorate further. I noticed that my complaints followed a predictable pattern. I would replay diplomatic failures from months earlier, thinking I should have handled that senator differently. I would project catastrophic scenarios weeks into the future, imagining what if the plague spreads to the capital while I'm away on campaign. These mental time travels were exhausting and counterproductive, stealing my focus from the immediate decisions that actually required my attention. One morning, while reviewing reports in my field tent, I caught myself in this familiar spiral of complaint and worry. Instead of following the mental rabbit trail, I forced my attention back to the immediate task, reading the intelligence report in front of me. I noticed the texture of the papyrus, the scratching sound of my stylus, the quality of morning light filtering through the tent walls. For the first time in weeks, my mind was completely quiet. In that moment of presence, I could see my situation with unprecedented clarity. The intelligence report contained information that I had been too distracted to notice in previous readings. A pattern of enemy movement became obvious that my worried mind had missed. Solutions to resource allocation problems presented themselves when I wasn't busy lamenting our supply shortages. I began practicing what I called the discipline of the present moment. Throughout each day, whenever I caught my mind wandering into complaint about past events or anxiety about future possibilities, I would deliberately return my attention to immediate sensory experience. What could I see, hear, feel, touch, or smell right now? What specific task deserved my complete focus at this moment? This practice revealed something profound. The present moment always contained everything I needed to respond effectively to my current situation. Past mistakes couldn't be changed, so analyzing them endlessly was pointless. Future problems might never materialize, so worrying about them was premature. But the present moment offered real information, real opportunities, and real power to take meaningful action. I discovered that presence was particularly powerful during difficult conversations. When dealing with obstinate senators or anxious generals, instead of letting my mind rehearse arguments or anticipate objections, I learned to listen completely to what was being said right now. This deeper attention often revealed underlying concerns that hadn't been explicitly stated, allowing me to address root causes rather than surface symptoms. The practice of present moment awareness transformed complaint from a habitual response into an impossibility. Complaints require mental time travel, but presence keeps us anchored in the only time where we actually possess any power to influence outcomes. Asterisk. Asterisk. The voice inside our heads narrates our experience of life, and most people never realize they have complete control over what that voice says. One spent years listening passively to an internal commentary filled with complaint, criticism, and catastrophic interpretation before I learned that I could consciously choose the story my mind told about events. The transformation began when I started paying attention to the language I used in my private thoughts. I noticed that my internal dialogue was full of dramatic, emotionally charged interpretations that bore little resemblance to actual facts. When a senator opposed one of my proposals, my mind would immediately generate the story. He's trying to undermine my authority and sabotage the empire. When supply lines were disrupted during a campaign, I would think, this is a disaster that will ruin everything we've worked for. I realized that between any external event and my emotional response to it stood an internal interpretation, and that interpretation was entirely within my control. The same event could be narrated as a tragedy, a comedy, a learning opportunity, or simply a neutral occurrence, depending on the story I chose to tell myself about it. I began experimenting with deliberate reframing when faced with setbacks. Instead of asking, why is this terrible thing happening to me, I trained myself to ask, what useful information does this provide? When confronted with opposition, rather than thinking these people are making my life impossible, I practiced thinking this resistance reveals something important I need to understand. One of my most powerful reframing techniques involved treating challenges as if they were training exercises designed specifically for my development. When barbarian tribes proved more resilient than expected, instead of complaining about their persistence, I told myself. The universe is providing me with exactly the level of challenge I need to become a better military strategist. When political negotiations grew frustrating, rather than lamenting the complexity, I thought, I'm being given an opportunity to develop greater skill in diplomacy and persuasion. This wasn't mere positive thinking or denial of difficulty. It was a fundamental shift from victim consciousness to student consciousness. A victim asks, why me? And focuses on unfairness. A student asks, what can I learn? And looks for growth opportunities. A victim complains about obstacles. A student appreciates the resistance that builds strength. I discovered that the quality of my internal dialogue directly influenced the quality of my decisions and actions. When my mind told stories of impossibility and unfairness, I became passive and resentful. When I reframed those same situations as opportunities for growth and learning, I became creative and energized. The most profound reframe involved changing my relationship with responsibility itself. Instead of viewing my imperial duties as burdens imposed upon me by fate, I began seeing them as privileges offered to me by the universe, rather than I have to deal with all these problems. I practiced thinking, I get to serve in ways that can make a meaningful difference. This shift from obligation to opportunity, from burden to privilege, from victim to student, eliminated the foundation upon which all my complaints had been built. True strength, I learned, has nothing to do with the ability to dominate others, and everything to do with the capacity to master yourself. The strongest person is not the one who can defeat enemies in battle, but the one who remains calm, focused, and virtuous, regardless of external circumstances. This inner strength is what makes complaint not just unnecessary, but literally impossible. My understanding of real strength evolved through years of testing. Early in my reign, I thought strength meant having enough military force to crush opposition, enough wealth to buy loyalty, and enough political power to impose my will. I measured my strength by external metrics, the size of my armies, the extent of my territories, the obedience of my subjects. But external strength, I discovered, is fragile and temporary. Armies can be defeated, wealth can be lost, and political power can be overthrown. More importantly, when your strength depends on external factors, you become vulnerable to complaint whenever those factors are threatened. You start complaining about inadequate resources, unreliable allies, or unfavorable circumstances, because your sense of security rests on things beyond your ultimate control. True inner strength operates according to different principles entirely. It's built through deliberate practice in small, daily choices that strengthen your capacity for self-mastery. I began developing this strength through what I called voluntary hardship, deliberately choosing more difficult options when easier ones were available. Instead of always taking the comfortable path, I would sometimes walk when I could ride, eat simple food when delicacies were offered, or sleep on hard surfaces when soft beds were available. These weren't acts of self-punishment, but training exercises for my will. I was building my capacity to remain content and focused regardless of external conditions. I practiced mental disciplines as rigorously as soldiers practice physical ones. Each morning, I would spend time preparing my mind for whatever challenges the day might bring, reminding myself of fundamental principles and visualizing myself responding to difficulties with calm virtue, rather than reactive complaint. Each evening, I would review my performance, identifying moments when I had responded with strength versus moments when I had allowed external events to disturb my inner peace. The most important component of inner strength proved to be the cultivation of virtue, regardless of consequences. I trained myself to ask not what response will produce the outcome I want, but what response would be most virtuous. Sometimes choosing virtue meant accepting short-term disadvantages or allowing others to appear more successful in the moment. This commitment to virtue over outcome created an unshakable foundation for inner strength. When your primary concern is maintaining your character rather than controlling results, you become immune to the complaint-inducing frustration that comes from wanting the world to be different than it is. I learned that inner strength grows stronger under pressure, like muscles that develop through resistance training. Each challenge that initially seemed like a threat to my peace of mind became an opportunity to deepen my capacity for self-mastery. The barbarian invasions that once frustrated me became training grounds for strategic thinking. The political opposition that once annoyed me became practice for patient diplomacy. Real strength means having such complete mastery over your internal state that external events cannot shake your fundamental peace, focus, or commitment to virtue. When you possess this strength, complaint becomes not just unnecessary, but literally inconceivable. One of the most counterintuitive practices that eliminated complaint from my life was deliberately imagining the loss of everything I valued. This exercise, which I called negative visualization, taught me to appreciate what I had while preparing mentally for what I might lose. The result was a profound gratitude that made complaint impossible and a resilience that made setbacks manageable. I began this practice during a period when I noticed myself taking my blessings for granted. Despite ruling the most powerful empire in the world, despite having access to unprecedented luxury and influence, I found myself focusing on minor inconveniences and small frustrations. I was complaining about senators who questioned my policies, while ignoring the remarkable fact that I had the opportunity to shape the lives of millions. I was grumbling about military challenges, while overlooking the privilege of commanding history's finest legions. The practice started simply. Each morning, I would spend a few minutes imagining the loss of things I valued. I would picture what my life would be like if I lost my position as emperor, if I became seriously ill, if close advisors died, or if military defeats cost us significant territory. Initially, these visualizations were deeply uncomfortable, triggering anxiety about possibilities I preferred not to consider. But gradually, something remarkable happened. By mentally rehearsing loss, I was immunizing myself against the shock and despair that typically accompany actual setbacks. More importantly, when I returned my attention to present reality, I felt profound appreciation for what I actually possessed, rather than irritation about what was lacking. I remember one particular morning when reports arrived of a significant military defeat on our northern frontier. Normally, such news would have triggered immediate complaints about inadequate intelligence, poor field command decisions, or the impossibility of defending such extensive borders. But because I had been regularly visualizing the possibility of military setbacks, I was able to receive this news with calm acceptance rather than reactive frustration. The defeat was certainly unfortunate and required immediate strategic response, but it wasn't a catastrophe that destroyed my peace of mind. I had already mentally prepared for this possibility, so I could focus on practical solutions rather than wasting energy on complaint about the unfairness or difficulty of the situation. Negative visualization also taught me something profound about the temporary nature of all external conditions. By regularly contemplating loss, I developed a healthy detachment from outcomes while maintaining strong commitment to virtuous action. I could work diligently to preserve and expand the empire while simultaneously accepting that empires, like all human institutions, are ultimately temporary. This practice extended to personal relationships as well. I would occasionally imagine the death of valued advisors, family members, or close friends. Rather than morbid pessimism, this exercise generated deep appreciation for the time I had with these people and motivated me to treat them with greater kindness and attention while they were present. The most powerful aspect of negative visualization was how it reframed my entire relationship with adversity. Instead of seeing setbacks as aberrations that shouldn't happen, I began viewing them as normal variations in the human experience that I had already mentally prepared to handle with grace and wisdom. Asterisk. The final breakthrough in eliminating complaint from my life came when I understood that virtue, wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline was the only thing that could never be taken from me, and therefore the only thing worth measuring my success against. Everything else that people typically use to evaluate their lives, wealth, reputation, health, external achievements, could be lost through circumstances beyond their control. This realization fundamentally changed what I complained about and what I celebrated. Before embracing this principle, I would feel frustrated when political opponents blocked my initiatives. Even when I knew my proposals were wise and beneficial, I would complain when military campaigns faced unexpected setbacks. Even when our strategic approach was sound, I was allowing external results, which were only partially under my influence, to determine my sense of success and satisfaction. I began asking myself a different question when evaluating any situation, regardless of the outcome. Did I respond with virtue? If I had acted with wisdom by carefully considering all available information, with justice by treating all parties fairly, with courage by doing what was right despite personal cost, and with self-discipline by maintaining emotional equilibrium, then I could consider the situation a success, regardless of external results. This shift was tested severely during one of our most challenging military campaigns. We had spent months preparing a complex strategy to neutralize a particularly persistent group of Germanic tribes. Despite careful planning and competent execution, the campaign produced mixed results due to factors beyond our control: unexpected weather, intelligence failures, and tactical adaptations by our enemies that we couldn't have anticipated. Under my old framework, this outcome would have generated significant complaint. I would have focused on the gap between our goals and our results, lamenting the unfairness of circumstances that prevented us from achieving total victory. But with virtue as my measuring stick, I could evaluate the campaign completely differently. Had we gathered and analyzed intelligence wisely? Yes. Had we treated prisoners and civilian populations justly? Yes. Had we shown courage in facing superior numbers and difficult terrain? Yes. Had we maintained discipline and order despite setbacks? Yes. By the standard of virtue, the campaign was entirely successful, regardless of territorial gains or enemy casualties. This framework eliminated complaint because it made my sense of success independent of factors beyond my ultimate control. I could lose battles while winning the war for my character. I could face political defeat while achieving moral victory. I could experience personal setbacks while making progress in wisdom and virtue. The practice also revealed how most complaints stem from confusion about what constitutes genuine success. When people complain about their circumstances, they're usually measuring their lives against external standards, comparing their wealth to others' wealth, their achievements to others' achievements, their recognition to others' recognition. These comparisons inevitably generate frustration, because external circumstances are influenced by countless factors beyond individual control. But virtue depends solely on our choices in each moment. No one can make us act unwisely, unjustly, cowardly, or undisciplined without our consent. External pressure can influence our circumstances, but it cannot corrupt our character unless we allow it. Nothing tested my commitment to eliminating complaint more than dealing with senators who seemed determined to oppose every initiative, generals who prioritized personal glory over strategic wisdom, and advisors who told me what they thought I wanted to hear rather than what I needed to know. These difficult relationships could have been endless sources of frustration, but they became some of my greatest teachers in the art of inner mastery. My initial approach to challenging people was to focus on changing them. I would complain privately about their stubbornness, their selfishness, their short-sightedness, or their incompetence. I would strategize about how to convince them, pressure them, or work around them. This approach generated enormous mental stress while producing minimal actual change in their behavior. The breakthrough came when I shifted my focus from trying to change others to using my interactions with them as opportunities for practicing virtue. Instead of asking, how can I make this person more reasonable, I began asking, how can I respond to this person with wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline? I had a particularly challenging relationship with a senator named Gaius, who seemed to oppose my policies purely out of personal animosity rather than principled disagreement. For months, I complained internally about his obstructionism, his political games, and his apparent indifference to the empire's welfare. These complaints were exhausting and unproductive, stealing mental energy I could have directed toward more constructive purposes. Then I began treating my interactions with Gaius as training exercises for my character. Each time he raised frivolous objections to reasonable proposals, I practiced patience and clarity in my responses. When he made personal attacks disguised as policy criticism, I practiced maintaining emotional equilibrium. When he spread rumors designed to undermine my authority, I practiced responding with dignity rather than retaliation. This shift in perspective was transformative. Instead of dreading encounters with Gaius, I began anticipating them as opportunities to strengthen qualities I wanted to develop. He became my unwitting partner in character development, providing precisely the resistance I needed to build greater patience, wisdom, and emotional resilience. I discovered that difficult people often reveal our own character weaknesses with uncomfortable accuracy. The behaviors that triggered my strongest complaints were usually reflections of qualities I struggled with myself. Gaius's stubbornness frustrated me partly because I recognized my own inflexibility. His political maneuvering annoyed me because it reminded me of times when I had prioritized personal advantage over principle. Rather than complaining about these uncomfortable revelations, I learned to appreciate them as valuable feedback about areas where I needed further development. Difficult people became mirrors that showed me aspects of my character that required attention and improvement. I also realized that everyone, including those who seemed most unreasonable, had underlying concerns and motivations that made sense. From their perspective, when I stopped complaining about their surface behaviors and started trying to understand their deeper fears and desires, I often discovered ways to address their legitimate concerns while still advancing necessary policies. The most profound insight was that other people's behavior reflected their character, not mine. I could maintain my virtue regardless of how others chose to act. Their choices were their responsibility. My responses were mine. I discovered that most complaints arise not from events themselves, but from the interpretations we layer onto those events. Raw facts are typically neutral. It's our perceptions, judgments, and emotional interpretations that transform neutral occurrences into sources of suffering and complaint. Mastering perception, learning to see events objectively rather than through the filter of personal preference, was perhaps the most powerful tool I developed for eliminating complaint from my mental landscape. The lesson began during a devastating flood that destroyed significant portions of our grain supply during an already challenging year. My initial perception of this event was entirely emotional. This is a disaster that will cause massive suffering. Why do these catastrophes always happen at the worst possible times? How can we possibly manage all these problems simultaneously? But then I forced myself to examine the facts without emotional interpretation. What had actually happened? Heavy rains had caused rivers to overflow, which had damaged stored grain in certain regions. That was the complete factual reality. Everything else, the judgments about timing, the predictions of future suffering. The sense of overwhelming burden were interpretations I was adding to the basic facts. This distinction between facts and interpretations revealed something remarkable. I had been complaining not about reality, but about my mental additions to reality. The flood was simply water moving from one location to another, according to natural laws. The grain damage was simply organic matter, returning to the earth sooner than planned. These events contained no inherent emotional content, no cosmic unfairness, no personal targeting of my administration. I began practicing what I'd called objective description, describing events in the most neutral, factual language possible, stripped of emotional interpretation. Instead of "we suffered a devastating military defeat," I would think our forces withdrew from a contested position. Instead of "these senators are impossible to work with," I would observe these individuals prefer different policy approaches than I do. This practice immediately reduced the emotional charge around challenging situations. When I described events objectively rather than dramatically, I could see options and opportunities that emotional interpretation had obscured. The flood, for instance, wasn't just a disaster, was also information about which storage locations were vulnerable to water damage, motivation for developing better distribution systems, and an opportunity to test our emergency response capabilities. I learned to question every perception that triggered complaint by asking simple questions. Is this interpretation necessary? What would this situation look like if I removed all emotional judgments? What facts am I adding story to? Usually, I discovered that my complaints were responses to stories I was telling myself about events rather than responses to the events themselves. The discipline of perception also taught me to recognize the difference between what is and what I prefer. Most complaints stem from the gap between reality and preference, but that gap exists only in our minds. Reality simply is what it is, independent of our preferences about what it should be. When I stopped adding unnecessary interpretations to events and started seeing them as they actually were, rather than as I wished they were, complaint became largely impossible. You cannot complain about objective reality. You can only complain about your subjective interpretations of reality. All the philosophical insights in the world remain merely intellectual curiosities unless they're integrated into consistent daily practice. The elimination of complaint from my life didn't happen through sudden enlightenment, but through patient, systematic cultivation of new mental habits. I developed a structured routine that transformed abstract, Stoic principles into practical tools for living without complaint. My daily practice began before dawn. In the quiet moments before the empire's demands crowded my attention, I would spend the first hour of each day preparing my mind for whatever challenges awaited. This wasn't passive meditation, but active mental training, like a general reviewing strategy before battle or an athlete warming up before competition. I would begin by reminding myself of fundamental principles that I controlled my responses, but not external events. That virtue was the only true measure of success, that every obstacle contained opportunities for growth. I would visualize potential challenges I might face that day and rehearse responding to them with wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline, rather than with complaint or frustration. This morning preparation proved invaluable. When the inevitable difficulties arose, reports of military setbacks, political opposition to necessary policies, or administrative crises requiring immediate attention, I was mentally prepared to respond from strength rather than react from emotion. The groundwork laid in the morning's reflection carried me through the day's trials. Equally important was my evening practice of honest self-examination. Before sleep, I would review the day's events and my responses to them. Had I maintained virtue under pressure? Had I allowed external circumstances to disturb my inner peace? Had I slipped into complaint rather than focusing on constructive action? Where had I succeeded in applying Stoic principles, and where did I need improvement? This nightly review wasn't self-punishment, but self-education. I was studying my own patterns, identifying triggers that led to complaint, and developing strategies for responding more skillfully to similar situations in the future. Each day's experience became data for improving the next day's performance. Throughout the day, I practiced what I called philosophical intermissions, brief moments of returning to Stoic principles during busy periods. When I felt frustration building, I would pause and ask, what would wisdom counsel in this situation? When faced with setbacks, I would remind myself, the obstacle is the path. When dealing with difficult people, I would think, this is an opportunity to practice patience and understanding. I also maintained the practice of writing my thoughts, which later became the meditations. This wasn't casual journaling, but rigorous philosophical work examining my assumptions, challenging my interpretations, and clarifying my understanding of Stoic principles through written reflection. The key to making these practices sustainable was starting small and building gradually. I didn't attempt to eliminate all complaint immediately, but focused on catching myself in the act of complaining and redirecting my attention to more constructive responses. Over time, this redirection became automatic, requiring less conscious effort and producing more consistent results. Most importantly, I learned to treat my practice itself as an opportunity for virtue, rather than another obligation to complete perfectly. Understanding Stoic philosophy was only half the battle. The other half was having the courage to act decisively on what I could control while accepting what I couldn't. Too many people use the dichotomy of control as an excuse for passivity, focusing so intently on acceptance that they neglect their responsibility to change what lies within their power. True wisdom requires both the serenity to accept the unchangeable and the courage to change what can be changed. The most significant test of this principle came during the height of the Antonine Plague, when traditional approaches to crisis management were proving inadequate. I could have used Stoic acceptance as justification for passive endurance, telling myself that plagues were natural events beyond human control, and that our role was simply to bear suffering with dignity. This interpretation would have been philosophically comfortable, but morally inadequate. Instead, I recognized that while I couldn't control the existence of the disease, I could control our response to it. I could organize more efficient distribution of medical supplies, implement better quarantine procedures, ensure continued food distribution to affected areas, and maintain public order during a period of fear and uncertainty. These actions required moving beyond philosophical contemplation into practical courage. The courage to act on what I could control required overcoming my own preferences for comfort and convenience. It would have been easier to remain in the safety of Rome, issuing orders from a distance. Instead, I traveled to affected regions to assess conditions personally and demonstrate imperial commitment to relief efforts. It would have been simpler to follow conventional approaches. Instead, I implemented experimental medical protocols and innovative administrative solutions. This active engagement with controllable factors eliminated a subtle form of complaint that had been undermining my effectiveness. The complaint disguised as philosophical acceptance. I had been using Stoic principles to avoid taking difficult action, telling myself that external outcomes were beyond my control, when what I really meant was that I preferred not to bear the personal cost of trying to influence them. True Stoicism, I learned, demands maximum effort in areas within our control, combined with complete acceptance of results beyond our control. This isn't passive resignation, but active engagement without attachment to specific outcomes. I could work tirelessly to improve imperial administration while accepting that some problems would persist despite my best efforts. The courage to change what I could also meant confronting uncomfortable truths about my own leadership. I had to acknowledge where my policies were ineffective, where my communication was unclear, where my decision-making process needed improvement. Rather than complaining about others' failures to understand or implement my vision, I took responsibility for ensuring that my leadership was as clear, compelling, and effective as possible. This principle extended to personal relationships as well. Instead of complaining about senators who opposed my initiatives, I could focus on what I controlled, how clearly I explained my reasoning, how well I understood their concerns, how skillfully I built coalitions of support. I couldn't control their ultimate decisions, but I could control the quality of my influence. The most profound application was taking responsibility for my own character development. I couldn't control the external pressures and challenges that tested my virtue, but I could control how diligently I prepared for those tests through daily philosophical practice. Asterisk, asterisk, as I near the end of my time on this earth, I reflect on what will endure after the Roman Empire itself has crumbled into dust. Empires rise and fall, monuments decay, and even the mightiest achievements of human ambition eventually return to earth. But the character we build and the wisdom we share can influence countless generations of seekers who choose strength over complaint, virtue over comfort, and inner mastery over external dominance. My military victories will be forgotten. My political achievements will become historical footnotes, and my administrative reforms will be replaced by newer systems. But the principles I've shared with you, the elimination of complaint through philosophical understanding, these insights can live on in everyone who chooses to apply them. This is the legacy that matters. Not what I conquered, but what I learned. Not what I built, but what I became. The greatest joy of my reign has not been expanding Roman territories, but discovering that any person, regardless of their circumstances, can develop the inner strength that makes complaint impossible. The slave in chains can possess greater freedom than the emperor if he has mastered his responses to adversity. The merchant facing bankruptcy can display more courage than the general leading legions if she refuses to be defeated by external setbacks. What I've shared with you isn't merely philosophy for emperors, it's practical wisdom for anyone who refuses to be a victim of their circumstances. Every person who eliminates complaint from their life becomes a beacon of strength for others who are still struggling with victim consciousness. Every individual who chooses virtue over comfort creates ripples of influence that can transform families, communities, and entire cultures. I've learned that true leadership isn't about commanding others, but about modeling the qualities we want to see in the world. When you stop complaining and start focusing on what you can control, you demonstrate that such an approach is possible. When you transform obstacles into opportunities, you show others that adversity can be a teacher rather than an enemy. When you maintain virtue regardless of external pressures, you prove that character is stronger than circumstance. The practices I've described, morning reflection, evening review, negative visualization, objective perception, the discipline of desires, these aren't burdens to bear, but tools of liberation. They free you from the exhausting cycle of complaint and reaction, replacing it with the calm strength that comes from inner mastery. Every day you practice these disciplines, you become more like the person you're capable of being, and less like the weak version that always complains. Your life, regardless of its external circumstances, can become a testament to the power of philosophical living. You don't need an empire to practice virtue or face great adversities to develop strength. The same principles that sustain me through plagues and wars can sustain you through whatever challenges you face. The same wisdom that eliminated complaint from my life can transform yours. The legacy I want to leave isn't just the memory of Marcus Aurelius the emperor, but the continuation of Marcus Aurelius the seeker living on in everyone who chooses to kill the weak. complaining version of themselves and forge an unshakable character through daily practice of philosophical principles. My time with you draws to a close, but your journey toward eliminating complaint and building unshakable inner strength is just beginning. Everything I've shared, from the dichotomy of control to the discipline of perception, from obstacles as opportunities to building virtue as your only true measure of success. These aren't just ancient philosophical concepts, but practical tools for transforming your daily experience of life. The path forward requires no special circumstances, no imperial authority, no grand stage for heroic action. It begins with your very next response to whatever challenge you're currently facing. Will you approach it with complaint or curiosity? Will you focus on what you can't control or what you can? Will you see it as evidence of life's unfairness or as an opportunity to practice virtue? Start where you are, with what you have, facing whatever difficulties currently occupy your attention. If you're dealing with workplace frustrations, practice seeing difficult colleagues as training partners for patience rather than obstacles to your success. If you're facing financial pressures, focus on what you can control, your spending decisions, your work ethic, your creative problem-solving rather than lamenting economic conditions beyond your influence. If health challenges are testing your peace of mind, remember that while you cannot control your body's responses to illness or aging, you can control your responses to your body's conditions. If relationship conflicts are disturbing your serenity, focus on what you bring to those relationships rather than trying to change what others contribute. The elimination of complaint from your life won't happen overnight, but it can begin immediately. Start by catching yourself in the act of complaining and asking, what can I control in this situation? Redirect your mental energy from lamenting what's wrong to identifying what's possible. Replace, why is this happening to me, with what is this teaching me? Establish your own version of my daily practices. Begin each day by reminding yourself of fundamental principles and preparing mentally for potential challenges. End each day by reviewing your responses and identifying opportunities for improvement. When difficulties arise, pause and ask what virtue would counsel in that moment. Remember that every person who chooses strength over complaint, virtue over comfort, and inner mastery over external dominance contributes to a legacy of wisdom that can outlast empires. Your commitment to eliminating complaint from your life isn't just personal development. It's a contribution to human understanding of what's possible when we refuse to be victims of our circumstances. The weak version of yourself that always complains is not your true nature. It's simply a habit of thought that can be changed through patient practice. The strong version of yourself that responds to challenges with wisdom and virtue isn't a distant ideal, it's who you become when you consistently choose philosophical principles over reactive emotions. Take what I've shared and make it your own. Test these principles against your real-life challenges. Adapt them to your specific circumstances. Most importantly, begin today the daily practice of building a character so strong that complaint becomes impossible. The eternal flame of wisdom now passes to you.